Hey guys, so I want to just take a second here and go through the kind of some of the major essay topics of period three, which would be the first period they can throw a DBQ at you from. So you've got this thing right here, right? This PowerPoint already posted on Canvas. But then the other thing I recommend you have is this. It's this handout. As you can see, I've kind of broken it down into different topics. You've got people, terms, events, synthesis of big questions and ideas. So my suggestion is this, right? That you probably want to print it, either type on it or handwrite it, print it out, and have it. So when you take the AP exam, that you've got this thing directly in front of you. And I'm going to do one of these for every period. So that should pretty much cover every potential essay topic. Now, if I miss an essay topic, right, like if I somehow don't cover it, here's the thing, I can't imagine the information you have will be useless. All right. So when you're taking the exam, what you're going to want to do is say, look at the question. Okay, what time period is this? All right, cool, great. Then go find the sheet that matches, and then you should start pulling stuff from it. Will it match up perfectly? I don't know, but I mean, it's insane not to give yourself a tool when you're taking the exam to help you, right? So let's go ahead and start going through the PowerPoint, and that way we can, feel better prepared for things. All right, so move this down here, get it out of the way. Cool. All right, so like I said before, the DBQ units 3 through 7, that's 1754, which we'll start with right now, through 1946, basically the end of the war. There'll be a total of 5 documents, still graded out of 7 points. And I think we'll talk about more about what I expect you need to score in order to get a passing grade and up that scale, probably. All right, so let's get going. So, all right, first thing, French Indian War. You know, they did this as an essay question 5 years ago. Could they come back to it? Potentially, right? Um, but I would be surprised, like really surprised. So what I recommend you doing is this: if you see this, all these names, these terms, these events, right, and some of them are in bold. To me, those are the ones that stand out the most. Those are the ones you should know cold. And besides just writing the name down, you should really know what they did, not just like a William Pitt, he was a prime minister of England. Okay, no, but what did William Pitt do in relation to the French Indian War? Okay, well, what would you write down? Well, let's see. He took over in the middle of the war because George III, the King of England, puts him in charge because George II died. Fun story, literally died on the toilet. Anyway, um, and William Pitt basically starts with what we call the blank check policy. What does that mean? It meant that basically he was going to do whatever it took to win the war. And so he started spending exorbitant amounts of money. So like William Pitt is, yeah, you're right, he's the Prime Minister of England, but you got to know what he does in relation to the topics. All right, and that's what I recommend for any of these things. Now, in terms of big questions that you might see come up on the exam, the two that I think are the most likely would be what are the causes of the war? But again, I would really downplay that one. I can't. It wouldn't. It would strike me as being out of the time period, really, because a lot of the factors that led to the war are from really Unit Two. But nonetheless, it's worth just covering to cover. The bigger thing is this right here: the results of the war. That was the question they asked the last time. Was how did the war change American history? All right, cool. So things we want to know. The war was a massive, huge war that led to lots and lots of debt. It led to a larger military presence in the colonies, so the British suddenly had an army there all the time, and that kind of created some problems. Lack of land. That goes to the proclamation line of 1763. The British basically said, yeah, congratulations, we won the war. We won all this cool land from the French, but you can't use it. You got to stay on this side of the imaginary line. All right, and that really angered the colonists, considering they fought for the war. Oh yeah, and they're paying these huge debt or taxes for it. The biggest thing I would probably do would be focus on the end of salutary neglect. This policy of basically hands off with the colonies, the British decide that that's no longer the policy, and they're going to start to, again, taxes. They're going to have a larger military. They're going to start exerting more control, and that's going to anger the colonists a great deal. So, end of salutary neglect is the big one, right? Now, what does that mean? It means that they controlled the land they could use, a larger military presence, huge debt and taxes slash more interference. And then there was just a general anger with the British. Their officers were rude to them. The military kind of lied to the militias. They didn't hold up in their bargain on certain things that they promised. So yeah, this is kind of the two. I would say this is the more likely of them. Just as my 2 cents. All right, change in British policy, kind of piggybacking off the last one. If they gave you this one, right, that would be in my mind a bit of a gift. And here's why. Because This is essentially the American Revolution, right? That's what this is. This is basically talking about how or what factors led to us breaking away. So, causes for the war, big causes right here, right? French Indian War, we just covered that one. The Anti-Slavery neglect, kind of just covered that one. The cultural shift goes back to Unit 2. We talked about how the colonies were less and less British on a regular basis. What does that mean? It means that, well, let's see, the British weren't coming to the colonies in big numbers anymore. They were the fourth most popular immigrant group. Remember that from Unit 2? We looked at the maps and the charts and all that, right? All right. And then we also talked about how even though people here might have, the original inhabitants might have been British, and there might have been waves of those people for 2 or 3 generations, the reality was after a couple of generations, you stop feeling strong ties to maybe to the mother country back in England. So even those who were English per se didn't feel strong connections to the country because they never lived there. It was just another. It was the flag that flew over the colony. They had more loyalty to where they lived. Now this would be kind of a little more specific changes in attitude slash end of salutary neglect. So there's a lot of resentment towards the British, which we already talked about. They believed that they were super corrupt. They believed that they were taking advantage of them. They had basically settled them with huge debt, not just like colonial debt, but also consumer debt. The British, through mercantilism, had basically forced them to buy loads of stuff, and individuals took on huge amounts of personal debt to buy new consumer goods. All right, increased control, higher taxes. So essentially, everything you see down here that I got bolded would kind of go right in here, right? Um, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, all those things, the Townsend Act, the Intolerable Acts, they're all great examples of increased control and taxation. Now, the other thing I think is super important are the violent clashes. Um, uh, One thing that we got to remember, as I talked about just a minute ago, there is now a stronger British military presence in the colonies, and that's going to lead to more conflict. So the two best examples we have here are the Boston Massacre, cool, and Lexington and Concord. Both of those are examples of the British military essentially marching on and using the violence against their own people. That's a kind of a game changer. Um, Other things we can throw in here just to add on to this change in attitude and to salutary neglect, reasons for the war. Both sides lack of communication or struggle to communicate. The British telling the colonists, you don't need representation in Parliament, you have virtual representation. There was the Olive Branch petition to try to solve this right before we actually had the war, and that got ignored. So, but on the flip side, you know, the colonists acting badly. There was the Boston Tea Party where they decided to throw all that tea in the harbor for no reason whatsoever. All right. So all of these factors kind of contribute to what causes the war. All right. Next thing. Uh, this is a little more complicated, and I could see them covering it because it kind of plays out in our modern partisan world. So the topic I labeled as Federalist versus anti-Federalist, but really I would look at this as beginning to see um, the birth of modern political parties. So let's first talk about the factors that led to the Constitution. So as we should remember, the Articles of Confederation, or AOC, was the original document that created or was set up to be the structure of our government. There's a whole list of problems. Go back to this unit, you'll find them. They're listed out. There's a bunch like inability to tax, lots of debt, no military, no trade policy, no judicial system. It's a long list. So I would know a couple really, really big ones that so that you understand what were the factors that led to the Constitution being passed. All right, kind of piggybacking off of that was something called Shays Rebellion. I think everyone knew that there was an issue with the Articles of Confederation, but the inability of the government to put down a open, violent rebellion in their own country is a bit of an issue, and so it began to expose the weaknesses of the system. And then the last issue was national debt, and what that basically meant was uh, each state had taken on debt during the course of the war. Some states have been more successful in paying it off than others, but the reality was, in order for us to establish, ourselves as a country, we needed to rid ourselves of the debt, but not every state was paying it off. And so maybe national debt we switch out for maybe like a lack of a coherent economic system might be a better way to put it, because there wasn't a currency, there wasn't each state operated as a different country, could set up tariffs and barriers for trade. It was just nonsense. All right, to me, the one that I would expect if they were to go to this time period out of this would be the birth of political parties. Again, we're living in a super partisan time. It's kind of a major topic. So First thing we want to know is Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Why do they matter? Because they're the ones who set up the debate and discussion that create the Constitution, right? The Constitution, kind of a big deal here, which I actually somehow managed to leave off of here, but write it down anyway. The Constitution gets created, right? They're the ones who are at the center of debates in terms of the Great Compromise. There's the Three-Fifths Compromise. All those really matter. Now, the thing I want to make sure we don't make the mistake of writing, if it comes up, is that Federalists and Anti-Federalists were the first political parties. That is not true. The first political parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Yes, the Federalists were basically the same Federalists who pushed for the Constitution, but now we're seeing a slightly different version of it. The Democratic Republicans are created in opposition to them. So in terms of major Democratic Republicans, yeah, Thomas Jefferson is the big one. All right, now, other things we want to know, the Alien and Sedition Acts. Alien and Sedition Acts, those were the laws that were passed during the quasi-war with France. The one that probably matters the most here is the Sedition Acts, and here's why, right? That basically made it illegal to criticize the government. That's kind of a violation of the Bill of Rights. And so the Federalists, run by John, who's at this point John Adams is the president, passes a law saying that the Anti-Federalists, the Democratic Republican Party cannot criticize them. And therefore, it's just clear violation of the Bill of Rights. But more importantly, thinking further ahead here, is that it shows that during a time of conflict, like the quasi-war with France, the United States will typically begin to strip away basic fundamental rights in the name of safety and security, right? And the Alien Act, or Aliens Act, is also part of that. And then we have the elections of 1796 and 1800. These are two pivotal elections. Why? Because they're the first true contested elections in American history. And it exposes two huge fundamental flaws with our system. One, the system we had was whoever got the most votes was president, who got the second most votes was the VP. The problem with 1796, they were from opposing parties. It was Adams, a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican. That doesn't work. Then 1800, we basically have this terrible system where there isn't a winner. And so we have to come up with what is essentially the Electoral College to solve that problem. It leads to the 12th Amendment. There's a lot of stuff that comes out of it. And it was a really nasty, nasty political election. All right, and it just clearly showed the divide between us. All right, last topic. Washington's presidency / early republic. So big names here, Hamilton, Jefferson, obviously Washington and Highland, because I think it was obvious. But here's what we want to do. Washington is America's first president, and he sets up a whole bunch of stuff that we should know. His farewell address. You got to know the various parts of it. He talks about a lot of really important things. He talks about, foreign policy, staying out of foreign wars, the dangers of political parties, the importance of a federal government, the importance of having a limited but still organized military, the importance of having a strong federal government. So in his speech, he basically outlines what becomes a lot of America's ideology, at least in terms of foreign policy, and a lot of the issues that will plague America for the next several, to be honest, centuries. He also sets up the traditions of being a president. 2 terms, a cabinet. How does a president supposed to behave? What do you even call a president? Don't call him a majesty. They actually thought about calling him His Excellency, and he thought that was a little much. So he became Mr. President. And then, again, foreign policy. Now, we can connect it back to the farewell address here, but we also can connect it to things like the Proclamation of Neutrality. We can kind of talk a little bit about the Haitian Revolution, how we stayed out of that. So, and we were having issues, just trying to trade with everybody, stay out of fights. There was Jay's Treaty. There's a whole bunch of things we can throw in your foreign policy related to Washington. And the last topic is Hamilton. So there's 3 things here. You should know each one of his reports, what they said, what the rationale was, what the logic was, and why they are significant. And which is essentially what these 3 things here are talking about. Things to keep in mind with the bus. You should talk about how, going to here for a second, how the cabinet Washington had was filled with both had Jefferson and Hamilton, and they fought with each other, right? That was his idea of getting opposite view or competing viewpoints. All right, you should understand why he wanted tariffs and how that was important to manufacturing and factories in America. He talked about how he was going to pay off the debt and how it was important to have good credit as a nation. So Hamilton, basically, the big idea, sets up the modern economy and puts us on a path towards industrialization and a stronger federal government, which flies in the face of the agrarian vision that Jefferson had. All right, guys, like I said, this is just a quick overview. You got to do the hard work. All right, guys, if you have any questions, let me know.